Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that might sound a little unusual, a little off the beaten path. We're talking about ancient skin conditions.
Skin
Yeah,
conditions.
I know it's not exactly like the sexiest topic,
Right.
but trust me on this one, because this deep dive, it's all about uncovering those unexpected insights. The kind that connect the past to the present in ways that we might not even realize. And for this particular deep dive, we're turning to the book of Leviticus,
Okay.
specifically chapter 13, which deals with what was called leprosy back then, and other skin ailments too.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so it's going to be really interesting to see, what we can uncover.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear what kind of insights we'll find there.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
What exactly does Leviticus 13 tell us about leprosy and skin conditions in that time? What was it like?
Well, it's really more of a detailed guide, not for doctors, though, it's for priests, on how to diagnose and manage these types of conditions. Now, it's important to remember that when they said leprosy back then, it probably referred to a whole bunch of different skin problems, not just the specific disease we know as leprosy today.
So it was more of a catch-all term
Hmm.
for anything that, looked a bit unusual on the skin.
Exactly. Yeah, like if you saw something and you're like, what is that? Leprosy.
Gotcha. Interesting.
Yeah. And, the chapter goes into a lot of detail, actually,
Yeah.
about the visual signs that priests were trained to look for. They were really looking for things like raised patches of skin, scabs, any kind of discoloration, changes in hair,
Mm.
and even like the presence of raw flesh.
Wow, that's pretty specific.
Yeah, they were paying attention.
It sounds like they were really meticulously trying to figure this out.
They were really observant.
Yeah.
I mean, keep in mind, this was long before microscopes
Right.
and lab tests, so diagnosis relied pretty heavily on what they could see with their own eyes. And so the text emphasizes being really thorough. It outlines specific criteria for determining whether someone was considered, get this, clean or unclean.
Clean or unclean. Okay, so what did those terms actually mean back then
Yeah.
in that context?
Right. So they went way beyond just like physical cleanliness,
Okay.
unclean in this context. Often meant that you were going to be separated from the community.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't necessarily because the person was, morally flawed or anything like that. It was more about public health and ritual purity.
So it was like a form of social distancing
Exactly.
or isolation, kind of like what we've seen in recent times.
Yeah. Like quarantine almost.
Wow.
So it's really interesting to see how these ancient practices, they actually kind of reflect an early understanding of how diseases spread
Yeah.
and the need to protect the community even way back then without the scientific knowledge that we have today.
That's an amazing connection.
Isn't it?
I'm also kind of curious about the role of the priests in all this.
Yeah.
Because they weren't doctors, but they seemed to hold a lot of authority when it came to making these health assessments.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it speaks to how religion, community, and healthcare were all intertwined in these ancient societies.
Mm.
Priests were often seen as like intermediaries
Mm.
between the divine and human, responsible for maintaining spiritual well-being and the health of the community as a whole.
So they weren't just spiritual leaders, but also kind of like community health leaders in a way.
Absolutely. It was all connected, yeah.
That's so interesting. So it wasn't just about like isolating people who were considered unclean and, leaving them to fend for themselves, right? Like there was a process for reintegration back into the community.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Leviticus 13 actually outlines a whole process
Okay.
for re-examination and potential reintegration back into the community. So if the priest, observed signs of improvement
Yeah.
and declared the person clean, then they were allowed to come back and resume their normal life.
Okay. So that's really interesting because it suggests that they understood the importance of not just physical healing,
Right.
but also like the social and psychological impact of being isolated.
Yeah. And also, it kind of shows an awareness of the potential for stigma.
Hmm.
By having a system for reintegration, they were trying to make sure that people didn't face long-term social exclusion because of these skin conditions.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess it makes you wonder, though, what that process of reintegration might have actually looked like back then.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, how did it feel for those individuals? Were they welcomed back with open arms, or was there still a sense of, suspicion or fear?
It's hard to know for sure. That's a really good question.
Yep.
And unfortunately, we can only speculate about the specifics, but it does raise some important points
Right,
about the challenge of stigma.
right.
Even when there are systems in place, specifically designed to address it.
Yeah, it's almost like no matter how much you try to have like a formal process,
Right.
human nature still comes into play.
Yeah, it's like overcoming those societal perceptions and prejudices. It can take a really long time.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we handle similar situations today. Like the stigma that can still be associated with certain illnesses.
Absolutely. It's definitely a timeless issue,
Yeah.
and it requires constant work and effort to really address it properly. But, going back to the text for a moment, we were talking about those detailed descriptions the priests use,
Yeah.
remember? That emphasis on observation.
Uh-huh.
That actually has some interesting parallels to modern medical practices.
Oh, you mean like how doctors today rely on like examinations and tests to diagnose things?
Exactly. The principles of observation, being thorough and gathering evidence to support your conclusions, those haven't changed that much.
Right.
The tools and the techniques have definitely evolved. We have incredible technology now.
Yeah.
But that basic approach to figuring out what's wrong and then addressing it, that's remarkably consistent throughout history.
I love that. It's amazing how these ancient practices can still have echoes in our modern world.
Yeah, definitely.
So as we're kind of wrapping up our deep dive into Leviticus 13, what would you say are the most relevant takeaways for us today? What can we learn from all of this?
Hmm. Well, I think it's crucial to remember that this ancient text,
Yeah,
even though it comes from a very specific context, a very different time and place,
right.
it still offers some insights that are relevant to us even now. It highlights the importance of public health measures, making sure the community is safe.
Yeah,
It reminds us that our physical, social, and spiritual well-being are all connected. They all influence each other.
definitely.
And it really drives home the point that stigma is an ongoing challenge.
Something we have to keep working on.
Yeah, it's not something that just disappears overnight.
It's like a constant process, right?
Exactly. It's a process, and it takes real effort to make progress.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, it's fascinating because we started off talking about something that might seem, I don't know, a little outdated.
Ancient.
Yeah, ancient skin conditions in the book of Leviticus.
Right.
And who would have thought that it would lead to all these, like, really relevant
I
insights?
know. It's amazing what you can find when you start digging into these old texts.
It really is. And it just goes to show that the past can offer valuable insights into the present.
Absolutely.
And that human societies, we've been dealing with these same fundamental questions about health and community and belonging for centuries.
Yeah, like it's a reminder that we're not that different from our ancestors.
Right, exactly. And it makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Like what other seemingly outdated ideas or practices might be hiding in plain sight, you know?
Ooh, that's a good question.
What else could we learn from the past to help us navigate the complexities of health and well-being today?
It's almost like there's a whole treasure trove of wisdom just waiting to be rediscovered.
Totally. Well, on that note,
Yep.
I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But I want to leave our listeners with that final thought,
Okay.
What can we learn from the past to help us create a healthier and more connected future? It's a question worth pondering. And I bet if you dig a little deeper, you might be surprised by what you find. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.